Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this event and for all of you for sharing this morning. I want to say it really is a special occasion for me. I don't often have a chance to convene with a group such as yourself, my colleagues in genetics, to talk about a topic that we rarely bring up in the laboratory. And I would love, maybe as the morning goes on, to talk to you about that, because I think the situation needs to improve in terms of people feeling comfortable in the laboratory talking about faith. So what you're going to see is that faith has become a very big part of PG Ed. It came something as a surprise to us, but I would say you could argue that faith-based projects at PG Ed are perhaps the fastest moving and most effective projects that we have at our organization. Now, to put that into context, I'll tell you a little bit about PG Ed, how it got started, excuse me, and what we do, and then I'll tell you some stories along the way that will tell you how we got involved in faith. So PG Ed started about 12, almost 13 years ago. Here we go. Because we became so cognizant of the gigantic gap in awareness between geneticists and non-geneticists about what genetics is, what it isn't, what it can do and what it cannot do, what it says and what it does not say. And in addition, the minimal amount of two-way dialogue between geneticists and the public which we serve. I think most of us, we rest our work on taxpayers' funds. And so we really need to hear what taxpayers think about what we're doing, and that two-way dialogue is really very, far too minimal. And so we started the Personal Genetics Education Project to try and address the gap in awareness, the lack of dialogue, hoping that there would be an increase in respect for diversity of opinions, because if there's anything people will disagree about from individual to individual to individual is their personal genetics. So we got started naively. We thought, oh, we'll go to high schools and we'll talk about genetics, because the next generation is always currently in high school. But what we realized very quickly, we went naively and saying, oh, we'll write us some lesson plans, is that if you talk to high school students or anyone, that the facts of genetics, the GATCs, the recessiveness, dominance, the epigenetics, all that is really not very gripping. But it's the decision-making process about how to use genetics that really can grip an audience. And in fact, in the end, you really don't need to know about GATC to grapple knowingly and confidently and with justification about the use of genetics. So our lesson plans actually rotate very heavily on the tricky problems of genetics. We now actually have lesson plans on DNA crime, law enforcement use of genetics, eugenics. We talk about consumer genetics, of course, CRISPR, and we are now working on lesson plans having to do with race. We go all over the country. We hold classes, and as other people start to use our lesson plans, we're focusing more on creating those lesson plans. And I will tell you, every classroom I personally have been in, I have come away far more enriched than what I left there. The energy of youth is admirable, and their willingness to be open and to think about other things is something that I don't think I could ever match. I was in a classroom once where there was tremendous disagreement, just fundamental disagreement about complicated issues such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, faith. It was actually a faith-based school, and so I had about 30 students in front of me, and they all seemed to have passionate feelings about complicated things such as termination of pregnancy based on genetic information. And I asked the young man to the right of me towards the end, I said, so imagine you're all sitting in your own homes. How do you feel about the conversation that you've heard? And he was wonderful. He said, I'm in my own house here. They were all sitting in their desks. And he said, well, it's not going to affect my friendship. I just think it's important that people know how I feel, and then we'll just go ahead and be friends. And I wish I'd captured that moment. It was wonderful. We also have an online game. That's probably not as exciting as it should be, but you answer 5 questions. You don't need to know anything about genetics to answer these questions. Everybody always gets 100% at the end, and at the end you get to pin yourself on a world map. We had someone in Antarctica who pinned us in Antarctica. Adam Steltzner, who is the person who put Curiosity on Mars, ran into him at a meeting, so he pinned himself on Bradbury Lane on Mars. So we call ourselves the first interplanetary educational program. And then I have another friend who works thousands of feet deep into the earth, and so he pinned himself there. So I think we're also maybe one of the deepest educational programs on earth. But it's fun. You can go anywhere and pin yourself. You can pin yourself several times. We have many different topics. And here are some of the pins we have. We also do work with film and television, because scalability, I think, is something that anyone in education or engagement struggles with. How do you scale up what you've worked so hard to make available for people? And we could not ignore the fact that film and television can reach tens of millions of people in a weekend, and if they log in or they turn on their television set once a week for the weekly shows, you see them week after week, millions and millions of individuals. And so we've been working with 2 organizations, one called Hollywood Health and Society, and the other being the Science and Entertainment Exchange of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they do is they put, and if you want to be involved, you just have to contact them. They frequently have producers and writers call up because they need to get a particular science fact correct. And these days that's essential, because with blogging and tweeting, when a producer or writer makes a mistake on a show, it just goes viral sometimes. So every once in a while we're contacted and we work with producers and writers. And after a while, we get to know who they are. It's a very competitive environment. Most times I've talked to them, I do not know what show they work on. Everything is anonymous. I don't know who I'm talking to, and I answer questions. I don't answer all questions. Sometimes I'm asked to lay out the details if someone wants to incriminate someone with synthetic DNA, and I just say, I'm sorry, that I will not answer. And then every once in a while, though, you do get to know the producers. They start to come back to you more often, and so we actually got to know the Grey's Anatomy crew quite well. And that, I don't know how many of you watched Grey's Anatomy. I have to admit, I did not, but then I've watched their episodes now. They did something really wonderful in that Bailey, I think, opened up a genome sequencing center, and I'll tell you a bit about that experience. We were answering various questions about genetic disease, how you detect them, what is the basis, and then one day they called up and said, you know, we think we'd like to open a genome sequencing center, which is great. And they said, how much money does it cost? So I told them tens of millions of dollars. How do you get that funding? I said, oh, it takes years. You have to fundraise, you have to write for grants. It's a long, long process. Well, little did I know, they just invented a very wealthy person who donated tens of millions of dollars to the hospital. And so they had their genome sequencing center rather quickly. And then they needed pictures. Like, what does a genome sequencing center look like? So I called up Heidi Ream, my good friend, and I said, Heidi, and she had someone in her lab take photographs of her lab, and then they reproduced that. So what you see when you go to Bailey Sequencing Center is actually Heidi Ream's laboratory. So it's a fun angle. I will say that very often they do bring up the ethical, social issues of genetics, and that is where I think people really become engaged. Hollywood Health and Society has an arrangement with the CDC where the CDC can track what questions come into them after various television shows. And Hollywood Health and Society works with many different television shows. So they can tell that when something, breast cancer or colon cancer or Ebola or anything comes up on one of these shows, that you get a spike in questions at the CDC. So television and film really is quite an effective strategy. Now the National Academy of Sciences has a Science and Entertainment Exchange where they hold retreats. They bring in writers from various shows and also the feature-length blockbuster movies, And you spend sometimes 2 or 3 days about one-to-one, writer versus scientist, discussing the breakthroughs, the cutting edge of science, what's it like to be a scientist, what do scientists struggle with, and I think they've done a fantastic job in increasing the inclusion of science detail in some of the blockbuster films you've seen. It is true, sometimes the detail does not come across exactly the way you would say it, and I want to give this one little anecdotal experience I had where I had my comeuppance. I was talking with with Sandra Buffington of Hollywood Health and Society, and I said, you know, that phrasing, what Bailey said was not exactly the way I would say it. And I think she was prepared. She looked at me and she said, well, how would you have said that? And so I gave her what I thought was a very careful, studied response and how I would have described a particular genetic test. And she said, what's your goal in working with us? I said, well, I would like to really increase awareness of what's going on in genetics. She goes, well, you just lost 20 million viewers with that one sentence. And I thought about it. She goes, do you really think that's going to make a difference for your goal? And I remember on that moment thinking, I don't think I'm compromising myself, but I do want to reach the public. And so I understand now a little better how sometimes the science that we hold so dear, in order to reach individuals, might need to be made more palatable. And the way I remind myself all the time is on April 15th when I'm filing my tax form. I say to myself, if someone were to come and say, let me tell you about item 35, and exactly what item 35 means and how it relates to item 33, I would not ever retain that. But if they said, if you don't fill out item 35, you are going to have a tax auditor coming, then I go, okay, and I fill out item 35. And that, I think, is how film producers and writers think about science. They make it relevant. All right, what's next? Yes, congressional briefings. So we work in schools, we work in communities and libraries, science museums. We go to, I think, what are they called? When you go to a bar and you talk science, all different levels at which you can interact. What are those called? Science cafes, that's right. We do all that. But we also want to interact with the policymakers and with the individuals who represent communities in Washington, D.C. So you know what I should do is check my time.
You're fine.
I'm fine? Okay. And I happened to talk to someone who works in Congress, and I said, you know, maybe why don't people, when they campaign, bring up genetics? And he said, genetics is the kiss of death if you want to be a politician and get votes. And I thought, that was very clear. We need to do something about this. So we called up Louise Slaughter, Congresswoman from New York, who passed away recently. She was a force. She's a microbiologist. And we said, would you let us come and do a congressional briefing on genetics? And we spent a lot of time negotiating this. I said, we will not complain. We will not ask for funding. We will not blame. We will not bully. We're just going to go there. Our sole goal of PG Ed is to raise awareness. We actually don't promote genetics. We promote awareness and information dissemination. So she let us come, and we were told if you get 26 people at a congressional briefing, that's a big success. So we thought, well, with genetics, maybe that's what we should aim for, 26. We got 76 people to the first briefing, which was a shock. It told us that people are interested in genetics, and I think many of the people in the audience, so these aren't the senators or the Congress people themselves, we have a few. It's the staffers who come. They are the ones who keep track of everything. Many came because of personal interest. So then because we did not, I guess, demand much, we just went there, present information, we were told after we came home, we thought it was all over, we could relax, they wanted 4 more. So I think there's a really interesting avenue here for communication. So we went back and we did 4 more briefings. The 5th one was actually on space and genetics, and that one was standing room only. We had over 200 registrants. It was, we could not actually accommodate all of them, and this is the room. There's tremendous interest in the use of genetics for protecting astronauts in space, and a lot of ethical discussion about the use of genetics for protecting astronauts in space. And then since then, we've actually gone back and done another one, and we are thinking we would like to tackle the issue of race. So that's been in the works. And here's where I would like to talk specifically about faith. I had not anticipated that faith would become such a big part of our efforts. It sort of crept into our thinking. Starting very early on, I had gone to a high school, very early on, public high school, very near to where I work. And the room, it's a public high school in Boston, the room had about 30 students, all of whom were people of color. The teacher was not a person of color, and that is just the situation a lot in public schools in Boston. The second I walked into this classroom, I could tell there was animosity in the room, and I know there was because I got to know some of the students very well afterwards, and they said, yeah, we were angry at you before you opened your mouth. And so I had come in with my PowerPoint. I put the PowerPoint aside because that was clearly not the mood in the classroom. And then they purposefully started chatting with each other and not paying attention to me. The teacher said, it's all yours. I could not get them to pay any attention whatsoever. And the room noise, the chatter just got louder and louder. And one young man to my right, who I eventually got to know very well, CJ, he pulled his baseball cap over his eyes and he put his head on the table. And as he put his head on the table, he said, what happened to the outreach person last Friday? And I realized every Friday they had people come to their classroom who would not come back. So, you learn so much in these very fast, short comments. So I said, I'm not here on outreach. I'm not here to tell you to stay off drugs. I'm not here to say stay in school. I'm not here to tell you that science is great. And finally someone said, lady, why are you here? And I said, I have 5 $1,000 tickets to a genetics conference, and I'm just wondering if anyone is interested in coming. And when I finished, immediately this young lady in the front row said to me, she said, there's nothing wrong with my genes. She goes, people say I get angry a lot. There's something wrong with my genes. She goes, there's nothing wrong with my genes. I have a lot to be angry about. And I thought, I've already learned so much about how little I know goes on in our public schools. I read the news, I read articles, I read editorials, and there's nothing like standing in a room with 30 really angry sophomores, all people of color who are just angry. And then another student raised her hand and said, who pays for all your work? So I guess the teacher had told them a little bit about what I did. So I told them about NIH and how most of my funding came from taxpayers, and that I was doing research to try and improve health. And all she said was, so, she goes, you mean my mother who pays her taxes and doesn't have any health care will never benefit from what you're doing? And I had to answer that. That actually was correct. That was the situation. And then CJ, who, I have to tell you, when he spoke, everyone listened. He was clearly the leader of his class. He said, I just have 2 questions for you, lady. He goes, do you believe in God and do you believe in evolution? And, that really threw me for a moment. He sincerely wanted to know. So I answered that I was not a person of formal faith, but being an open-minded person, and from experiences I've had, I did not think that everything we knew about physics, chemistry, and biology could explain everything that we are. And as for evolution, I said, I see experiments, I see what happens, but science is based on repetition, and as far as I know, Earth was not created twice. So then he said, well, when do these diseases hit? So you could tell that it was very important that he understood where I stood with regard to faith before he was going to engage in a conversation with me. And then he said, so I said, well, a lot of these diseases, they come around when you're older in life, 50s, 60s. And he laughed. He said, lady, I don't care about living to 65. Because I just don't want my brothers and sisters stabbed and killed before they're 20. And that was his way of saying, everything you plan to tell me is completely irrelevant to me. And I will tell you, after that point, we had the most amazing conversations, this class and I. They were so frank about how they felt about what we did. And I think it was very early on in PG Ed days I realized we were coming in quite arrogant, quite inexperienced, and there was a lot of partnership we needed to make. And I've learned since then that partnership and trust, these are words that can be very offensive to some of these communities because it assumes that they will partner with you and assumes that they will eventually trust you. So I've had discussions with my staff, who you will meet later, who have said, you need to come up with another word. So now sometimes we use the word connect, because you can connect in many ways, positively as well as negatively. All right, so this is after that conversation with, and I'm going to finish up very quickly now. Unfortunately, it took too long with my stories. I started cold-calling churches in my community, especially in the Boston public school system area, because I really wanted to talk with some pastors about how it is churches manage to go into all communities, wealthy as well as extremely disenfranchised, and manage to make a connection with their community. Scientists have so much to learn from that. And I got answering service after answering machine till Pastor Keck picked up his phone. I think I was shocked to hear him. He was shocked to hear me. He says, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I'm a geneticist at Harvard Medical School, and I would love if it's all right to come and talk with your congregation about some of the genetic technologies that are coming along." And I probably babbled a bit because I wasn't expecting to actually talk to someone. And he said, "Please do come. We talk about this quite a bit." So I met his congregation. They were the most understanding group. I am not versed in discussions of faith. We had a conversation where they would periodically say things like, "I think what you want to say here is clergy. I think what you want to say here is the New Testament." So they were wonderful, and I talked about, and CJ came with me. CJ actually worked with PG Ed for a while. We talked about genetic technologies, and it is clear many of the things geneticists do put into they're in great contrast to faith tenets of many faiths. But when I asked them whether their community, their church, would be willing to work with PG Ed to disseminate information about genetics, even though they disagreed with many of the things that were being discussed, it was 100% yes, that they would do that. And later on, when I was talking to another pastor, he said, "Of course," he goes, "the house of God does not close its doors." And it's all about helping communities. And so I just want to say that I think I have never come across, time and time again, a greater warmth and dedication to the mission of human welfare that I have come across in terms of, with working with communities of faith. So through that meeting, I got to know Chad Baldanza and Pastor Nathan Bartzi, who are from Christ the King. And they eventually participated in our industry forums. They join us now in a number of conferences we've been at or we've organized having to do with genetics. They are wonderful resources in helping people figure out this intersection between science and faith. And they are very accommodating and understanding of every step that I have to learn along the way. This is Michael Friend and Shakir Cannon. I met them through Joe Handelsman of the Office of Science and Technology Policy under Obama. They had approached Obama's group to ask about including their minority coalition, primarily African Americans, because of the issue of sickle cell. The African American community is ravaged by sickle cell in our nation. And matching that is a desire to, in some communities, to apply genetic information. Matching that is, as you can understand, hugely justified suspicion and concern about working with a community that has in the past greatly mistreated their community. But Michael and Shakir are dedicated, well, Michael, I have to tell you, Shakir actually had sickle cell and he passed away recently. Very young man, huge dedication, huge loss to his community. Michael carries on alone to try and infuse more genetic information into his community. So we are now working through churches that we met through Michael and Shakir. We also have made a connection with Louise Wang, who is Assistant Dean and head of the Center for Research and Science at Azusa Pacific University, a very prominent Christian university, and she and I thought we'd test the waters. She called me one day and asked if I would come. Of course I would come to Azusa Pacific. The room was packed. The conversation was great. And once again, although there was a lot of discussion about the ethics of some of what geneticists do, there was complete agreement that we would work together to try and reach communities that we might otherwise not be able to reach. And then, in fact, Louisa went and organized another meeting recently bringing many universities together, and that is Michael Doherty of ASHG. He often participates with PGED, and here he's leading a discussion in what we call a Four Corners activity. And then we also have a Muslim group that we're working with in Cambridge. The chaplain at Harvard is Khalil, and he's bringing together his Muslim community to also discuss genetics and the Muslim religion. And then finally, I really want to acknowledge Jennifer Doudna. So Jennifer, as you know, of CRISPR fame, recently got the Gairdner Prize, and she, in recognition of the need to engage with non-geneticists on these very complicated issues, donated the entirety of her Gairdner Award to PGED and has continued to support PGED. And when I asked her what project in particular she wanted us to dedicate these funds to, she said it was communities of faith. So thanks very much to her, we've been able to expand our project. And I will just tell you that PGED recently has formed a consortium, and we are about to expand. You can see the groups that have joined this consortium, and I need to explain very briefly how that group came about. We realized that our little Department of Genetics could not possibly manage to scale up the way we need to scale up. And there were issues happening in our country, race-based divide, animosity, just becoming rampant. And so we had an idea. We weren't sure how well it would go over, so we contacted these institutions, in part because, as we called them up, we said, this is not an award. We said, this is an acceptance of responsibility, because in these institutions that many of the transformative technologies were developed. In addition, we selected them because I had some personal connections with their chairs, and we needed to have some difficult conversations about what the goal of this consortium would be. And one of the primary ones is we would not judge anyone on their personal beliefs, be it about faith, be it about race, or anything, that our sole goal would be to be a conduit of information and communication and dialogue. And I will say they all agreed immediately. There would be no judgment. We would focus solely on dissemination of information. Second of all, these institutions are very wealthy. And we asked them whether they would be willing to lend their name and their reach to raise substantial funds, not for themselves or for ourselves, but to disseminate to smaller institutions that do not have funds to do this, and they agreed. So this was our pilot. We were incredibly enthusiastic about the result, and we are now in the phase of expanding. So if you're interested, please contact PGED. And finally, this is my team. Actually, the team has changed. We're growing. CJ's left, and Fabienne's gone back to the Boston school system. We've been joined by Robin Bowman and Florcy's there, excuse me, and Vika. And who I really also want to acknowledge is Cliff Tabin. He is the chair of the Department of Genetics. And he, several years ago, said that he was going to take research funds that had been allocated to our department for the whole purpose of reaching communities, because he felt he could not morally continue to head the Department of Genetics without making sure that equal to the research that we were doing, there would be an effort to reach to the communities that we serve. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you.